if the U87 can't solve a problem, the SM7 can. And to me, there's almost no in between, because as much as I'd love to play around with like 2 mics or something, I don't think for me as a producer, it's sort of like a negligible difference at the end of the day that like I might find something cool out of it, but like it takes away from the like creative process for the band for me to like fiddle with mics and things like that. So I know everybody knows what the SM7 sounds like. Everybody knows what a U87 sounds like. I'm doing less problem solving in a room I'm not used to with one of those 2 microphones, especially the SM7, because it's so tightly around a vocalist, especially you build a little bit of booth. I know exactly what I'm getting, even if I don't trust the monitoring. That's kind of like a way for me to build like a fail-safe, knowing that no matter what happens, I'm leaving that room with something I can work with.
Hey, hello everyone, and welcome back to another week of The Record Process. This week, we are joined by Sam Guaiana. Sam is a producer, mixer, and songwriter from Toronto, Ontario, and he's worked with a ton of bands like Silverstein, The Devil Wears Prada, Intervals, Trash Boat, Light Pacific, and a ton of other amazing artists in the rock and pop space. But we've asked Sam to join us on the show to talk about a specific record he made back in 2021 in the middle of the pandemic with an Australian band by the name of Between You and Me. We get into how the pandemic affected the timeline and ultimately the environment in which the record was made, the unique order of operations Sam has developed around his production process with bands, and how he adapted to an unfamiliar studio and space halfway around the world to get this record done. We cover it all in great detail, so you know the deal. Here comes our interview after a quick note from our sponsors. First, I'd like to thank DistroKid, who has graciously offered to sponsor this season of The Record Process. DistroKid is the most affordable service for independent artists to distribute their music to all streaming platforms, and it comes filled with a suite of tools to help you elevate your career. DistroKid not only allows you to spread your music across the streaming ecosystem, and yes, that includes TikTok, but it also helps you share your story with labels via the Upstream tool. You can engage your fan base using its text messaging feature and even create unique lyric videos. Record Process listeners now have a chance to get 30% off the first year of their membership at DistroKid. Just head down to the show notes and sign up using our affiliate link. We can't wait to hear what you've been working on, so don't hesitate to reach out to us at TrueLevelStudio.com/The Record Process and share your release plans with us for the upcoming year. And next, I'd like to give a huge shout out to Sheet Happens Publishing. They're a company that works directly with artists to create accurate and immersive tab books, vinyl, and other merch that allows fans to get one step closer to perfecting the soundtrack to their lives. I recently had the pleasure of putting together a book with them for my band, The Wonder Years, and trust me, they are incredibly thorough and dedicated to artist-approved accuracy in all of these books. Every tab book comes with the accompanying guitar profiles, which is very cool, allowing you to jump right into playing along with your favorites. Head over to sheethappenspublishing.com to check out all of their offerings and be sure to enter the code TRP15 at checkout for 15% off your first purchase. That's sheethappenspublishing.com, promo code TRP15. So go check out their amazing library of books, and happy shredding, my fellow guitarists. Sam Guaiana, welcome to The Record Process. Thanks for being here, buddy. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
We are good. Tom, how are you doing?
You know, it's really, really hot in Philly right now.
Okay, well, I said we are good, and maybe I spoke too soon. I'm pretty cool and comfortable down here in Atlanta. However, it does feel like I'm kind of swimming through a maze of pollen. But otherwise, aesthetically speaking, spring in Georgia, this being my first spring down here in Atlanta, is beautiful. So in a very good mood and ready for a super fun chat with you, Sam. I feel like we've been like chasing each other and talking about how excited we are to get on the horn and have like a serious chat about, you know, process, making records, and finding that specific one. And this is going to be really fun because I actually, even just from afar, remember seeing you online and Instagram kind of documenting the time and place and the making of this record. So we were hoping to finally get the full story and all the good and maybe bad and lonely details of how this record went that you did with the lads down under in the band Between You and Me, working on the record Armageddon that came out last year in 2021. With that, let's dive in and let's start with, let's start at the beginning, as they say. How did you come about getting connected with this band, and what was that initial introduction like?
So I think it was like mid 2019, they started talking about what they want to do for another record. You know, I've always kept my eye on them. I kind of like cut my teeth doing like pop punk records and stuff like that. So I never want to be pigeonholed in one genre, but I think that kind of like, you know, just sort of like aggressive pop punk stuff has always been the like, you know, reason I make records at the end of the day. So I was like reaching out to different bands. I had my manager sort of reach out to different people, and they were coming through town. It was like November 2019, and I knew that they're ready to like, you know, looking to record, looking to figure out what to do next as a band. So I was like, cool, I'll catch a show. I'll grab some beers with them. We'll talk. And they were just like hilarious human beings, like really fun to be around, just like a really easygoing vibe. We connected on like discussions about records we liked and, you know, the ways we wanted to sort of record it. And this was pre-COVID. So this was like, you know, yeah, you guys, end of next tour, you're here, we'll book the record, we'll come in, we'll make a record here, we'll have a blast, you know, just, you know, typical record cycle stuff. Obviously, none of it went down like that.
Which brings us to this conversation in a lot of ways. Yeah, I'll say a bit of a wrench thrown in the gears there initially. Mm-hmm. So you kind of had them on your radar as a band to begin with, and they maybe were there any specific pieces of work that maybe they referenced, or you mentioned kind of having that like sit down, what a wonderful pre-COVID time it was now in hindsight, where you could just go into a bar and sit down with a band and have some beers and not have to worry about masks, vaccination status. Am I going to get COVID and the whole tour is going to get shut down? Yeah. So yeah, it did make that part of it a lot easier before all of this happened. What were some of the records that you guys bonded over? Do you remember?
I think we were sort of just talking about like, well, I know they were like fans of like the like Pacific records that I have done in the past. Mm-hmm. And we sort of just talked about different pop punk records in the scene, how they sort of sound, who's sort of producing them, and kind of like, how do I word this? They were also sort of transitioning as a band at that point, where they didn't want to just be sort of like a cookie cutter pop punk band. They very much wanted to open up and just try some different stuff, try to be a little more poppy on the production end. So we talked a lot about like different pop music, kind of just like anything that sort of struck our ear. We talked about, you know, a lot of pop punk these days has a lot of like 90s, like Third Eye Blind influence, and like even for them to a degree, like a handful of like Oasis records that we were talking about. And like you'd put that record on, you wouldn't think those influences were buried in there, but like there's so much of that pops out just in little creative ways of how that's done and how we sort of talked about at the beginning. And it was nice. It was like there wasn't a record that we would throw at each other that, you know, we all collectively weren't a fan of at the end of the day. So it was really kind of like a big bonding experience at that point.
Yeah, it's such an innate shared conversation and shared appreciation of that stuff, which I think is in successful times how that like kind of producer artist meet cute kind of works really nicely.
Yeah.
And you just know even with Wonder Years, yeah, we've had a lot of calls over the years with people that we didn't end up working with, some of whom we obviously did. And it's an interesting thing. And Tom and I also obviously like having been on some calls with different artists and bands and trying to really like both vetting each other, but feeling out, it's like, is this the right project for me? Is this the right, you know, client to work with? And then on both sides. But sometimes when the business stuff gets taken out of it, you're like, oh, right. Yeah. We are all kind of here because we're music nerds and we love that record and you know, how sick is that? So I love that. Also, we will have to chase the 90s alt rock resurgence that you alluded to in a lot of your productions and just in the general vibe of music in the 2020s, because that's maybe a whole other podcast in and of itself that,
Oh, absolutely.
that we can start. But I can't go down that rabbit hole right now. I promised Tom that I wouldn't. But so that's amazing. And so it kind of started. So you booked it and you had it on the calendar, and then COVID happened.
Yeah.
You know, as to put it as bluntly and shortly as possible. I guess we don't need to fill in our audience in terms of, you know, the details. Everybody lived it in their own hellish way. But I love the old "where there's a will, there's a way" adage. So what kind of happened next? How'd you have to shift and pivot? What was that discussion like?
It's funny because like that's exactly it. It was definitely a "where there's a will" situation. They had a tour that started in Toronto in February 2020. So we all met up again. We got some sushi. We hung out. They left Toronto. The tour was supposed to end in Chicago at the end of March. And then April 1st or 2nd or something like that of 2020, whatever the Monday of that week was, was like go-to start date for the record, like right here, like at this studio. And obviously, you know, March 15th rolls around, whole world starts shutting down. Their first instinct was a really good one. It was like, I want to start the record early, but thankfully that didn't happen. Let's head back to Canada. We'll grab an Airbnb. We'll hang out for a couple weeks. We'll keep writing. We'll do some pre-pro, and then we'll start in April. You know, like we're already here. I know the world's shutting down, but it's going to be 6 of us locked in a room. We're not too worried about COVID. We're not too stressed about the environment. Literally 3 days before we started the record, Australia put out a thing to all their nationals around the world. Like, hey, if you're Australian and you're not in Australia by like, you know, next week, you're stuck wherever you are until we say fit.
Yeah.
So I'm not even kidding. 3 days before we start recording this record, they all hop on like flights to get home. And that was a nightmare for them because flights were so hard to get to Australia that they had to pay like, they bought like first class tickets because like there was no other ticket available. Everybody's, yeah. And it's really, what's really funny is so like I said, they just finished a tour. They were actually just here crashing at the studio for a couple of days. They showed me the Airbnb because I thought they were kind of down the street from my apartment, which is about 20 minutes from here. They showed me the Airbnb that they were staying at was literally half a block away from the studio. So 2 weeks before we make this record, they're literally sitting half a block from the studio. They don't know where the studio is. I don't know where they are because we can't really see each other because, you know, we're not allowed at this point or anything. They are so close to making this record, so physically close, so close time-wise to making this record, and it just fully falls apart like a couple days before we make the record. So it kind of was just sort of spinning our gears. You know, I thankfully had a handful of mix work, so I kept sort of, you know, I was locked in here on my own. I didn't see a lot of people. This building that the studio's in was completely dead, which was actually kind of nice. And we just started planning, you know, like, are they going to cut the record at home when stuff calms down? Because Australia went into mega lockdown mode. They put a curfew up. There was masks even if you were walking outside. Like you couldn't do anything in Australia. So we were like, are we just going to, you know, try to do some Zoom sessions, try to produce the record over the internet, and then I'll mix it all, or what's the thing? And I think in everybody's mind at the end of the day, regardless of the budget, regardless of how to make this happen, was like, we kind of all want to be in a room to make this record. So let's better safe than sorry. Let's like see when we can actually make that happen. And it sort of kind of panned out to be November 2020. And then, yeah, just the process of that started where they applied for a visa for me, which was basically a very like a COVID specific visa that allows you into the country just to work for, I think it was like 6 months or something like that. But I don't know if you know, but like getting into Australia at the peak of the pandemic, Australia was like the most closed down country in the world. So it was like it was literally no better way to put it than like until we pressed record on the first thing on this record, this entire process was like an uphill battle. Like it was figuring out flights constantly getting canceled, flying into Melbourne, and then Melbourne stopped taking direct flights, flying into Sydney, and then being like escorted off of the plane by military into a bus that takes you directly to a hotel for 2 weeks that you just can't leave. I call it like, it felt like rich person jail. Like you're in this little hotel room that's kind of nice. You're like, they knock on the door every few hours and feed you, but you can't leave. You can't do anything for like 2 weeks straight. You're just locked in a hotel room. And it was a pretty crazy process just to like get to making the record.
So I mean, where do we even begin with that, Tom?
I know, right?
Rich person jail. They were extremely stringent about their restrictions for sure. In spite of all of that, you still, initially, and not to blow smoke necessarily, but they must have really wanted to do the record with you if they, like jumping through that hoops and figuring out the amount of paperwork to get it done, which is awesome. And it's got to make you feel good. We're big, mindset people. I think that's a big part of the process.
Yeah.
And, environment and all that stuff. And so we're definitely going to touch on that. But I'd like to do even more because I remember seeing you almost kind of like live, like vlogging of that 14 days on Instagram. And I remember like in the hotel room by yourself. What does that do to a person if you're going into a record and you're like, yeah, I'm going to be super creative, can't wait to do this. And then you're like, but first you have to sit in a room with your own thoughts for 14 days. What was that like?
It was a nightmare. There's like no better way to put it. I went crazy for sure. I definitely had a bit of a like breakdown about halfway through, but it was like, the toughest part was like acclimating to the time. Cause like from here to Australia is just insane. And I tried to keep myself busy with work. Thankfully some people were able to bring me some stuff. So I was brought like a guitar and a couple weights so I could just try to stay active in the room and things like that. It was crazy. It kind of tore my mind up a little bit in the sense of, the second I was tired, there was a bed like 2 feet away from me. And it would be like 5 p.m. I'd be like, don't go to sleep because if you'll never recover from this if you fall asleep. And I can't tell you how many days I basically passed out at 5 p.m. on a bed and woke up at like 2 a.m. like, oh, I'm awake. What do I do? And there's like obviously nothing to do. So that like 2 weeks of that, really intense COVID testing. Like it's not just they didn't just do like the one nostril and done. They did like both nostrils, both sides of my throat. Like, they bring you your meals. They knock on the door. You open the door. There's like army guards like standing outside on every floor. Like no balcony. I can't open any windows. So I'm like sleep deprived. I'm trapped in a room. I'm trying to talk to my like friends and family, but they're asleep when I'm awake and things like that. So it was kind of like just. I completely lost track of time. Like I didn't know what day it was. Sometimes I didn't know. Also, it was really nuts because it was also right at the beginning of the American election. So everybody was like focused on that. And I'm Canadian, but American politics kind of affect the entire world at the end of the day. I'm sitting here losing my mind watching like American politics thinking like I should be doing anything else but this right now in this mental state. Like I'm going nuts. What am I doing? And it was like, oh man, it was just from beginning to end. That quarantine process was like me slowly devolving into like a crazy person and then being let out on the 14th day. Like, the sun, like, just like, oh my God, the real world actually exists. And what's nuts is on top of all this, sorry, I'm like tangenting a little bit because it's all like a crazy thing, was at this point, Melbourne, like I then got on a flight from Sydney to Melbourne. At this point, Melbourne had 2 full weeks of 0 COVID cases while Toronto and the US were at their like highest peaks, maybe the entire thing. Like Toronto was having 5,000 plus cases a day in a city of like 3 million people. And like hospital, like ICUs were completely overloaded. And I'm here halfway across the world in the summer too, because at home it's winter. In the summer, 1 week we have to wear masks. The next week we don't have to wear masks outside. The next week we don't have to wear masks inside. The next week we can go dining. It was, by the time I left, it was, I think, almost 2 straight months of actually 0 COVID cases in Melbourne.
Wow.
So I was in like an open world while the other half of the world, or like, where I was from was like in flames, basically. It was kind of, that kind of screws with you a little bit too. And you're thinking you get this like taste of freedom after, quarantining for 2 weeks when when COVID starts, quarantining for 2 weeks when I get off this plane, like all this like shut downness. And all of a sudden it's like everybody ripped it all off. And you're like, you can do literally whatever the hell you want right now. You're in a normal world where COVID kind of doesn't exist right now. So it was a lot of overwhelming feelings back to back.
Yeah.
I guess like when you were there for those 2 weeks, was pre-pro already done or for this record, or was like that on your plate as well as like trying to get through those 2 weeks?
It was sort of partially done. We definitely looked at a few songs. I set up a couple sessions on my laptop in the hotel room, but I also remember struggling with my laptop at the time. I was trying to mix a record on it in the hotel room at the same time, and it was just not going well. But no, pre-pro wasn't really done. We scheduled 6 weeks for the record, and part of that was doing pre-pro. And then also the way I kind of make records is I sort of do pre-pro. I mean, pre-pro doesn't really stop like until the end of the record these days, but especially on that record, it was sort of looking at a couple songs at a time. So we would sort of zoom in on like 3-4 songs and focus on the pre-pro of those, and then dive into working on those songs. And then, the next week, look at a few other songs. So it's sort of this like, anytime I make a record these days, if I have the opportunity, it's like a revolving door of how to look at songs, basically just to keep the flow constantly going. Because I find when you do all the pre-pro first for some records, you're kind of just, it's like 2 straight weeks after of just monotonous like engineering with a little bit of fun production here and there, instead of like being active in the moment of that song.
I actually want to stop you real quick, because I'd love you to elaborate on that a little bit too, because as you know, a lot of different producers have different methodologies and adapt to, their own things that they're comfortable with, and some are way more malleable with however the band wants to do it or feels good about doing it. What's led you to using that kind of framework? Is it a general actual care for drummers or bass players that normally have to wait around for weeks before they like pick up their instrument again to do a whole record? Or was this kind of forged out of seeing the benefit of that workflow in like almost like a song by song or a few song by song?
So the first thing I started doing, which kind of led me down this path, was I started doing drums last on records. And the reason I did that was because a lot of the times these days, I mean, the timelines to do records are nuts. It's like, you got 20 days. If I'm lucky, I'll get 25 or 28 days to do a record. But these days, it's like, 20, 23 days. The band has never played any of their songs live once. They've just, 2 dudes in the band have demoed them, and then one guy has recorded the vocals to those demos. So, like, the classic way of, like, pre-proing a record where every member kind of knows what they're doing doesn't really exist with younger bands as much these days. So doing drums last, the thing that allows is, like I was saying, pre-pro almost never stops. So say if all the vocals aren't written yet for a song, and a vocal might influence a pause before a chorus or something like that, when you track drums, you're just the biggest instrument on the record, the one that takes the most mics, and you're dedicating 2 full days to just drum tracking, and it has to be edited before you track anything to it. You know what I mean? Like it's such a laborious process that if you do that first and you commit to that, you're like shooting yourself in the foot these days in terms of producing the rest of the record around a drum idea, basically. So with the advent of like being able to program drums and everything, I kind of just make sure that we can get some sort of fundamental programming down where the kicks and snares are sort of in the right spot with some, whatever the cymbals are doing. I don't care about drum fills. I don't care about whatever. And then basically pre-pro the song in the sense, or produce the song in the sense of like, let's start tracking through. Oh, cool. Well, we realized while you guys demoed this that you're playing one rhythm one way, you're playing another rhythm another way. The drummer thought the rhythm was this. What's the best rhythm? Okay, cool. That's the best rhythm. And you adjust the fake drums to that, and you track that, and you sort of move on. And what I started realizing was, as nice as that is to do, it's incredible, by the way, for some records, because then also too, you just leave the last couple days for drums, track them. I can send them off to the editor, and nobody on my end is waiting around to keep tracking at that point.
Right.
We were already done the rest of the record. But what I started realizing doing this was, how can I make this, like, to me, that's a creative process, because there's no pause in creativity or no days off. I mean, there's, I usually take 1 day off a week, but like no like waiting around days off. What do we do next? That sort of evolved from doing drums last to this sort of, okay, well, we've got 3-4 weeks to do a record. Let's just kind of break them up into mini EPs or mini styles of the songs. Here's the fast songs. Let's do a week of those. Here's the slow songs. What I'll try to do, I won't try to do this all in 1 week because I'd go nuts, but like, here's 2 finished songs and 1 song that needs a lot of work. So let's do a week on those 3 songs. And next week, here's 2 songs that need some work, and here's 2 songs that will blow through in a day each song. So
right, very intuitive. Your 7-minute opus and your 1-minute obligatory banana beat song. Yeah, I see. Exactly. I see the logic through and through. No, and that's That's a really inspiring way to look at it, Sam. And I'm glad that you brought that. I'm sure a lot of our listeners will really get a lot out of that, even just walking through that process, whether they be musicians, engineers, or like walking through what making a record looks like, because I think nowadays with the advent of obviously music tech and going from the analog era to the digital realm, a lot of those things influence the process, right? In that way too, budgets and the amount of time that shrinks, but you're still expected to deliver the same incredible project like you had everything figured it out from the start. It kind of backs you into a corner to think creatively like that. And then, the other side of it, and we'll kind of keep moving on, but the goal, the mindset thing of breaking things down into smaller, more manageable pieces on a week-to-week basis is really interesting too, because there's a helpfulness in that for a band, knowing when they have to show up, what kind of mindset they can be in, and can live inside a song where if you're a drummer, it's 3-4 days of hell. And then if you're a bass player, it's great. My vision of the record is the drums and then all scratch guitars. And then I guess I'll see you guys in a month and hopefully it'll sound better.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and Wonder, like with Wonder Years, we've made records like that. Tom and I have both, I'm sure you've made records like that too. But so it's interesting that, when you can break it down and you say, it's like, okay, let's do like the ballad songs. Then you can really like just be okay with being there, because you're not forced to switch gears on a dime and being like, cool, now we're doing like the slow, like 6/8 waltz song. And the one we did before was like the straight ahead, stiff as a board, kind of like angsty punk throwback, track.
Yeah.
So, and that's a hard thing, especially for drummers, but even just vocalists, like being in the right frame of mind and just from like an endurance standpoint is really, really difficult to get the best out of them. So I love that. And I just wanted to, bookend that real quick for everybody that was listening, because I think that's really cool. But Tom, I know you had a question. I can always sense it.
I wanted to say, like, what kind of studio was like were y'all working out of that like allowed for that flexibility? Was it a couple different studios? Like, did you have the drums set up like just from the get-go and kind of were just like, oh, drum day, here we are?
I wish we did. I mean, lately I've been able to do that a little bit more, but no. So this record was kind of the like testing point to see if I could do the 3-4 song a week thing and drums last. We were in sort of like a producer room. They had a friend in Melbourne who had this like big studio that was just full of producer rooms. Like there wasn't really live rooms or anything like that. And I'm a huge, huge creature of habit. I'm very much, even when I've done records in really big studios, if it's like a lockout for like 6 weeks or whatever, I will bring my iMac and I will hook my rig up. So even if there's this huge console, like I have complete control over it at the end of the day, because a lot of my workflow is I track everything DI, and then if I reamp, I'll do it at mixing time or things like that. All that really mattered to me, like I've been in this habit, especially since Australia, I've been in this habit of trying to just do records in different places. It's very much like an important vibe for me to like, for me as a producer to like be out of my element too, because it forces me to think differently than go reach for a piece of gear that's here. Or I've got like a ton of Evertune guitars, and I don't remember last time I've used any of them because I've done so many records in like different places lately. So it's sort of, I think we were just in this producer room, a buddy of theirs. There was a room next door where a drum kit was set up, and that was more so the drummer could just work on ideas after we would pre-pro them, but we never actually recorded any of those. It was sort of like a jam room for him. There was no vocal booth. We built a vocal booth out of like mattresses and blankets and just stuck an SM7 there. And I tracked that entire record, aside from drums, I tracked that entire record on an Apogee Duet.
Cool.
Just like I'm very much the kind of guy, like I know my limitations. I set up sort of like a dummy chain in Pro Tools, kind of sort of like almost like how UA's console does like printing on the way in. So I had this like dummy chain through like some Slate plugins. So even though it was Apogee's super clean preamp, I had like a preamp emulation and a compressor on the way in, and I like treated it as if I was at home in my studio able to track. And what was nice with that, any 2-channel interface is like one channel was always dedicated for any guitar or bass we wanted to track if we were in the mood to wake up and just track guitars instead of vocals that day. And then, let's bounce to some vocals. Cool, we've got 2 inputs. We can toss over and start tracking some vocals. So it was like really good to try this whole whatever we're in the creative mood to do that moment, we will do. If you're burnt out playing guitars, if you want to write a lead riff and you're not ready, or if you're just, we've done 3 straight days of guitars, I don't want to do this anymore. Cool. Let's jump to vocals. If you're, if you wake up with a bit of a sore throat and today's not the day, cool. We've got other things to do. You even even if we set 3 songs that week and there's nobody's ready to do anything, cool, let's just dive into pre-pro on a 4th song. We'll save some time the following week. So it's just this perfect workflow of whatever you want to do. I want to accommodate the artist, and that also keeps me on my toes and keeps me creative at the same time too. So it was just, it's a super nice workflow that I've just refined over the last, pretty much since that record. I've refined it more and more and more as I've sort of moved on.
So cool.
Thank you.
If you didn't track drums there, where did you end up tracking drums?
Oh man, so we went to this crazy studio in rural Melbourne called, I think it was Beveridge Road it was called. And it's this house that has a full recording studio attached to it. And the live room, I guess, was just sort of this really long lounge room that was perfectly, it couldn't have been more perfect for a drum room. It was, I think, 15 feet by 30 or 32 feet. The ceilings were peaked up at around 16, 17 feet right in the middle. There was a garage right off of it, which I'll tell you why I loved in a second. And then it's this perfect brick room with carpet for a live room where the drums are as far back as possible. I could put really good room mics. Right next to it was a little bit of a lockout space, so I put a mono room mic there, and right behind that was a garage, so we left the garage door open and put a room mic in there as well. And it was just, I think to date, probably my best drum sound at just this little studio out in rural Melbourne somewhere.
Oh, big words. And I love to hear it. What's so satisfying too, especially after such a hellish journey to get down there, and such a long time coming. Also, the second you said garage off it, I was like, if you didn't put a mic in there, Tom and I are upset. So great. But I knew you would. I knew you did. I'm sure it sounded awesome. And someday I'll chase you down for the isolated files to be like, let me hear those drum mics.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And I want to get into, the details of the songs and how they were reworked and how you worked with the band. But first, I want to finish up talking about what it's like to play the traveling producer, right? And you mentioned sometimes you'll bring your own rig, so you have, that level of familiarity. What's your process like for getting comfortable for yourself, whether it be sonically, with monitoring, walking into a new space, a new environment, knowing what you like and what you like about, your own studio? But this is also part of the world that we live in, where so many of the productions that Tom, myself, and so many other people doing what you do are getting more and more familiar and comfortable with is kind of A, working remotely, but also B, there are times that you need to be face to face, and that there is this magic and communication and connection that is really tough to replace over, a digital screen. That's also part of the reason why, and I'm sure you're the same way, the Zoom world and video chat, even just more so than a phone call or email, is something that, is really at the bare minimum when it comes to production and working on someone's art and giving feedback. It just needs to be there, because otherwise so many subtle tones and the trust that you're trying to build it can really fall flat and go off the rails very quickly if you're like, what are you saying about my voice? What are you saying about that lyric?
Right. Yeah.
And it's about being personable. But how do you take that when you're completely out of sorts in a different environment? I take it you had never been to this studio, maybe either of them, but the studio that you track drums at, or the other space. What was the name of the other space, by the way, that had
I think it was Marshall Street Studios it was called.
Okay. What do you do to adapt to go in there and make yourself comfortable and make sure, because you're the captain at the helm, part of that job and that role is making sure the band is also comfortable and feels good and feels invigorated. How do you deal with that?
So one of the things I do, coming back down to sort of refining how I produce records over the last few years is, so the first thing was definitely I didn't use the studio computer. I used my laptop actually to track the whole record and the duet. I mean, it was a pretty well treated room. I didn't like the monitoring there was, but there were HS8s or HS7s in another room, and I've used the HS series stuff before. So I was like, cool, if we can use those, I'll at least have a rough idea of what I'm listening for at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And then also I'm very much a creature of habit with gear. So, I know my duet works well. I know if I set up the dummy chain that I'll get the results I want. For vocals, it's either an SM7 or a U87. Like, I'm not picky with microphones. If the U87 can't solve a problem, the SM7 can. And to me, there's almost no in between, because as much as I'd love to play around with like two mics or something, I don't think for me as a producer, it's sort of like a negligible difference at the end of the day that like I might find something cool out of it, but like it takes away from the like creative process for the band for me to like fiddle with mics and things like that. So I know everybody knows what the SM7 sounds like. Everybody knows what a U87 sounds like. I'm doing less problem solving in a room I'm not used to with one of those two microphones, especially the SM7, because it's so tightly around a vocalist, especially you build a little bit of booth. I know exactly what I'm getting, even if I don't trust the monitoring. That's kind of like a way for me to build like a fail-safe, knowing that no matter what happens, I'm leaving that room with something I can work with.
Mm-hmm. You're controlling the amount of variables, basically. So you're
exactly,
It's that those are two that you're taking the mic variable out of the chain and the environment and everything. If it's unfamiliar monitoring, speakers, room, etc. That's a great point, and that's a great lesson too. It's like sometimes the tool that even if it's not as shiny as X, Y, and Z other tool, sometimes knowing how to use it is way more important, and knowing what you'll get out of it and what you can depend on it is way more effective than kind of going in completely blind and then being like, ooh, didn't realize that was going to turn out that way, So, that's great. That's such a wonderful answer and some great perspective on that. I love that. And I'm sure any listeners that do dabble either in, traveling or recording or, understand a lot of that process by listening to some of these episodes. That's an incredible takeaway there, Sam. Yeah.
Thank you.
And Sam, so like since like production, and we'll just like call it production rather than like pre-production. Since like production never stopped on this record, was there one song that like changed significantly?
Yeah. Oh, tons of them, actually. I'm trying to think. Okay, so there's a song on the record called Real World that we didn't finish while I was there. We had no vocals for it. We were trying so many vocal ideas, but it was kind of, I think we almost had the mindset that it might not make the record, but the idea was, I loved the song personally. Musically, it was really cool. And I trust the vocalist, Jake, to do pretty much, anything he puts his mind to, good things will happen at the end of the day. So it sort of was like wonky and had this cool little like programmy drum beat happening through the whole song. And then when I left, basically we had a couple Zoom talks about how to sort of deal with this last song. And as he wrote the lyrics to it, the beginning of the entire song completely changed. And this was, 6, 7, or even longer. This is like, at this point I'd already left. It had already been a couple weeks past. Like, I think it was already the beginning of 2021 at this point, because we did the record at the end of 2020. And he sent me the demo that he worked on with the engineer who did a little bit of vocal production on that song. And the whole thing changed so drastically. And I think that song kind of needed that in the moment to like, for everybody around to sort of enjoy it and for everybody to connect with it on a little bit of a deeper level. It was like, hey, this song might not make the record, to all of a sudden, this is like one of the best songs on the record, because all we did was axe the goofy drum beat and have it start with just the piano part right away. It was one of those things that happened so late in the game that, I think at that point, with us thinking it might not make it on the record, and with us, being so deep into the record, probably lost the objectivity to be able to do something like that until we stepped away from it for like 2 months, you know what I mean? Or like a month and a half. So it was really nice to see that when he came back with vocal ideas and talked to me about it, that what he came back with was just as strong as everything else on the record, and we didn't just phone that last song in. So that was definitely one of the songs on the record that had a lot of change in terms of that.
Oh, that's brilliant, man. I mean, what a great example of giving something time and space to kind of breathe and come to you. And sometimes what you mentioned too is like, with record deadlines and timelines, you don't always have that.
No, yeah.
That room and space to just kind of let something lie and then, go walk off. We talk about this a lot, with songwriters, some of the episodes we've already done in interviews where, and just in general, where sometimes you got to just like stop, put down the pen and go live life, and something will hit you the second you stop thinking about what's this chorus going to be or why isn't it working, you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
You gotta kind of distance yourself and that portion of your brain to creatively to kind of unlock it and go think on something else. That's why a lot of people are like, oh, I love drawing, because the second I focus on something else other than lyrics, all that other shit pops into my head. And that's exactly, it needed that time and space. And so cool, once again, the fact that you had that time and space after you left to trust them, right? Obviously, you probably already aware, trust is another big theme with us on the show, and rightfully so, because it's kind of everything when you're talking about the creative process and working with other people on something that's on art that's very personal. And you were, in this case, able to trust him to go work on it and find something that was going to either work, or to say, hey, this isn't feeling right, I don't want to force it, you know? And I commend you for that. And that's such a cool anecdote. And then you go back and it's like, now anybody, that's familiar with that record, or if you're not, that's such an interesting thing to be like, well, what did the old version sound like? Doesn't matter, you know? They'll never have it colored the same way. And the fact that you can look at it in hindsight like that is so awesome for so many reasons too. So I love that. And that's also kind of a theme too, where nowadays you don't get the time to kind of do all of it up front, you know, and have it all figured out. You know, sometimes there is that little 11th hour magic.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think any record I've worked on, that's kind of happened to some degree, where like, and some records too, that ends up being like the best song on the record, the one that you just kind of like had to pull out of nowhere at the end of the day. It's just like, oh, you know what? This song actually rocks.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's always something to say about like the track or the tracks that are like just like stewing in the back of the brain.
Yeah.
For so long. And like, there's a whole bunch to say on it. But dude, awesome. So from I guess I'm really curious at where like is like production never ends, but do you like define a line between like, okay, we're done cutting the record, this is kind, or like, where's that line?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's only abandoned.
Yeah. Right. Tom, you're right. I think a lot of young engineers are kind of told to like, you know, compartmentalize, like, and I do agree with this adage, you know, record like there's no mixing, mix like there's no mastering kind of thing in its own way. But I'm curious, Sam, because, and Tom and I were talking about this before we jumped on here, because you notoriously, you know, do a lot of, well, it's not always, handling every part of the process for every record you work on. This, like many of the other records, you both produce and then see it through all the way to the end with the mix vision as well. So I'm curious from what that kind of process, how you break that down in your head to maybe provide limitations for yourself or those check-in points so that you don't overmix or add too much, you know, things like that. I'm sure it changes, but maybe with this record specifically, you could give us some examples.
I'm pretty generous when it comes to time. If we're in a place where like, you know, if we cut the record at this studio, we go over by a day or two. At the end of the day, I'm not super bummed about that, because like the end result bears like everybody's cooperation, you know, like the end result is all of our product at the end of the day. It's not just the bands, it's not just me making a record, like it's very collaborative. But in a situation like going to Australia, especially in the middle of a pandemic, it's like, well, when I fly home, like I can't do anything else at that point. Thankfully, they had a really competent engineer with them throughout everything, so that was why that one song was able to sort of get a fresh life breathed into it, like, you know, a month later. But in that moment, you don't really think about that. You're just thinking about how to get everything done. So I have no better way to put this, but I have a really uncanny ability to hear a finished song in my head, like the second I hear a demo. And a lot of bands don't. So sometimes what will happen in the process is, and it happened on this record especially, is I just look at a band and like, I just need you to trust me right now. Like if we don't get every guitar down, I promise when I'm home, I'll add in the guitars that are missing, you know, like I just trust me that this thing is going to rock at the end of the day. Just let the process sort of happen. So to me, in a situation like this record, it didn't even end during mixing. Like in mixing, I was finding synth sounds to put in and cool little samples to like sneak underneath, or loops or things like that to like lift choruses. What I tried to do specifically on this record, and what I've been doing a lot lately, is I try to mix like 1 to 2 songs a day tops, especially if it's a record I've produced. I'll probably only do 1 a day because I want to sit there with the song about a week after we've tracked the record. I haven't even opened anything yet. I consolidate everything because, like, you know, I do vocals in one session, I do drums in another session, I have the main like working session. I bring everything into the working session, do all my edits, sort of just hit play and just listen to the song and see sort of what's lacking and where it's lacking production wise, and just try different things out. And sometimes it's me removing things we've tried, or sometimes it's me adding a whole new, you know, removing the drum beat and making it a program drum beat, or, you know, affecting a vocal for a whole verse instead. You know, it's just like these little things. A lot of the times they kind of happen in mixing, and it's why as a producer, I'm really apprehensive to hand off stuff to a mixer, because then I don't get me wrong, if I have to, I will. And what I'll do is I'll then spend that extra day per song just kind of having fun with it, like I would be mixing it. But so much of what I think people associate my sound with at the end of the day is the mix that comes from the production I started. Mm-hmm. And that's because exactly that, there isn't a point where I call it quits. Like, I could have delivered your mix or the first mix, and then I'll listen back like, oh man, I forgot the tambourine in the chorus, and then message you like, hey, don't listen to that mix. I've already deleted it. Give me 5 minutes. I got to put a tambourine in real quick. You know, so it's like, it's this thing that to me is constantly evolving until it's not. And I really try my hardest the second I send that final mix out to be content with it being finally produced at the end of the day.
I mean, if we're kind of in that space in the like sending the mixes out to the band, that can be a very scary time for a producer, a mixer, you know, depending on the band. But in this case, you know, you have a history. So there's a level of comfort and ease because you know who's on the other side of those mix notes and those revisions.
Yeah.
But sometimes there's not. And what's your you know, what's the general process for, and maybe there were any examples where, you know, if the band had a different vision, or not to say that they didn't enjoy what you were doing, but, you know, sometimes, especially, you know, you mentioned some heavy like pop influences coming into this. And Tom and I were remarking that, you know, there is some of that like very like groove oriented, very like fat, rich, like drum and bass stuff, you know, on this record that is much more like pop centric in its vocal treatment or approach, you know, that fits on the record, but might be calling on some inspiration. But I'm sure that there must be moments where, you know, it's a delicate balance as you're kind of weaving in and out of that. And, you know, what does that look like if you get to a point where the band has a different vision? You know, when do you know to push back, or, you know, and say, hey, like, I know you might be undecided, but really trust me that this is gonna, you know, that this works. Or do you always just default to the band and say, this is your record? You know, obviously they have the final say, but, you know, that can be a tricky line to walk sometimes, especially when it's like, well, now this is really what it's going to actually sound like. There's no more, trust me, wait and see, you know?
Right. Yeah.
So how do you tackle that?
It's funny. I've got a few different examples that are probably the best way to explain this. For a record like Between You and Me's record, because I think we all poured so much into it, there was a really big level of trust that, you know, like when the first mixes showed up, the notes I got weren't catastrophic at the end of the day. They weren't like, oh my God, the drum sound is so off, or oh my God, like I hate how the vocals sound. Like we were so connected through the whole record. We were so focused on those elements at the time we were producing them that I think, you know, aside from, hey, maybe make this song a little roomier, or hey, maybe make this song a little this, it was very much like first pass was the general idea of what we were all going for. But there's been times, there's a, you know, when I produced a record last summer, I don't know what happened. I want to blame, I changed a power amp in the studio, and it's kind of screwed the levels between my mains and my sub. I want to blame that, but honestly, I think I was just in a weird spot where I sent the first mixes to a band, and they were like it literally, like, actually after the second mixes I sent, or the second, because I always mix like one song first before I send everything, just to make sure I'm, doing what everybody wants. I sent that first mix and they were like, let's see, keep going. Let's see what happens. I sent the second mix and then I got a phone call and I was like, oh my God, I got to get fired. But the phone call was like, are you doing all right? Like, what's up? Like, you've definitely done better than this. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? I felt it too in that moment. And I think it was nice to know that I wasn't crazy for feeling like it was like I was struggling with the mix, that it was actually like seen that I was struggling with it. Because then at that point, I just went home for that day, did nothing else, cleared my head, showed up the next day, mixed it a third time, and very much third time's the charm. That was like the one that everybody was dying to hear. And then also I have a version of that where, so, that's the one where it's like the band trusts me, I trust the band. The first mix is what everybody wants. The band trusts me, I trust the band. I'm not trusting myself, clearly, and like they're noticing and they're actually being very supportive. And the third is when I'm just doing like a mix job, I'll always talk to the band like, hey, I know you hired me because of the things I've mixed in the past, but this is your song at the end of the day. Is there something A, out of my catalog that you like the sound of, or B, that, reference wise that you're trying to go for in terms of whatever? You guys have done other records. Do you want me to check those out? And I actually recently mixed a band, 3 songs for a band where they told me that they really wanted a certain type of mix. The production wasn't really recorded like that, So now I'm trying to make sort of a mix around a production that doesn't really honor it. And I think, and then so I do the mix. They're like, we still want a little shinier. Okay, cool. This is a little bit out of my comfort zone for this mix, but here you go. They love it. And then the producer calls me and goes, that's pretty shiny. Like, what's going on? It's like, well, are you not discussing with the band what's happening here? Like, they want one thing, you want another thing. I wanted basically what they wanted. I wanted basically right in the middle of the two of them at the end of the day, because the production called for one thing, but clearly they want it to sound a little bit more modern. And in those moments, it's just like, is this just like a too many cooks in the kitchen thing? Is this like, who's listening to who? And because I'm hired by the band, or I mean, at this point I was hired by the label, but like had conversations with the band about the final sound. I don't want to like offend another producer, but I'm just going to go with what like the band wants at the end of the day, because that's the reason I'm involved in the process at all.
Yeah.
So it kind of, it's very dependent, but for the most part on records, and this is also why like I'm doing my best to constantly like, I have no problem mixing anything that shows up on my desk, but I really struggle to let productions go to other mixers because, yeah, it just doesn't end until right at the end. And part of that is showing that first product to the band as a collaborative thing. Like, here's the thing we spent 6 weeks halfway across the world making. How are we finally feeling? And then that moment of, oh my God, we did it. Like we all realize that this is what all that, quarantining for 2 weeks and going insane was for at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a great feeling, right? I mean, I'm sure you can say, and we won't drudge through any of the like lesser, wins. Everybody has those hardships coming up. I'm sure you have records that you're like, that just, I didn't love it, right? We're all our own worst critic as well. But when you have that sense of, wow, we really I had this vision, we nailed it, and everybody's, elevated in that mood when it's all said and done. That's amazing. And also something that we don't always talk about here, but this kind of gives me an opportunity to mention is enjoying that, right? Enjoying those wins and sitting back. I think it's something, and Tom and I'm sure we'll have a continued laugh about this, but I'm just like yourself. Like, I think a lot of people in the music production world are always very much go on to the next thing. And there is something to be said for that. You can't pine over projects that you don't get, projects that don't go the way you hoped they could or thought that they would. But when you have those where a record comes out, and that's why you mentioned it, and I love to hear it's like, that was my best drum sound. It's like you wish there was like like some way that you could hang best drum sound plaque on the wall. You know what I mean? Like,
absolutely.
These are parts of that process where, and even songwriters, right? There's like, this song, the way the narrative came together, it hit and it made the rest of that entire project come to life. And it's this awakening for a band, right? And I think you have so many of those working with a band like this, lyrically, right? Melodically, sonically, from an arrangement standpoint. And then even taking that, that song you mentioned and letting it go and saying, okay, let's see what you can do with it. Let's give it some time and play with it, right? But then at the end of it, Sure, you have that day where it's like, it's out. Here's, I'll post the single. But, being able to sit back on that and say that regardless of what level you're in, artist side, production side, is really great. And I think it's really healthy that, that you take time to kind of do that and look at the things that you did really well, and not just the things that you did poorly. Because I'm sure what it feels like to just be like, yep, they're finalized. And then you go hear something on a phone and you're like, oh, I never realized that kind of poked out a little bit. Damn. Right. And so we all have those. And it's like, I'm struggling with one of those right now where, full disclosure, I went back and like, that's what they wanted. And the overlaid like parallel processing just was muted accidentally in a certain thing for the picture. I'm like, it's fine. It's a creative decision, I guess, but the band likes it, And so, it's interesting, but I just wanted to pause too and say that, I'm glad that you can look at a project like this that had so much go into making it happen, that it turned out that way. Cause it doesn't always have that like super happy ending. And that's part of the ups and downs of this business,
Definitely. Yeah.
Tom, I'd also with your permission to talk about, we talk about committing, and Tom has a big background work for ATR and just like, doing things to tape and that mind and like the tape mindset, right? Versus, a bit more of what you're describing, which is, become maybe a more modern process that has really great benefits for you. You mentioned DIs and taking like the guitar shaping sound. And I know as a guitarist and someone who kind of dabbles in both the simulator world and has also come and has a heavy appreciation for, the analog, like real, like pushing air sound of a guitar. What's your feeling on that? And is that a mixed decision in the process? Is that an arrangement decision for you? Is it a bit of both? And or does it depend on the band?
I won't say it depends on the band, because I think in the past at least 3 or so years, this is how I've made a record. You know what I mean? Like I can't tell you the last time. Actually, that's not true. But like I just don't mic up amplifiers. Like I've never mic'd up a bass amp, or at least can't remember the last time I mic'd up a bass amp. When it comes to guitar amps, if the opportunity arises, like the new Silverstein record, we had one amp that was set up that was just for fuzz guitars and feedback and gross noise at the end of the day, and then the rest of the record's just all amp sim, because workflow wise it was great. But I don't want to leave it up to the band entirely unless the band's core sound is maybe real amps to begin with. You know what I mean? Yeah. But if it's more of a modern pop punk band or like a metal band or something like that, like they're already so versed in the, they're already touring with Kempers and they're already making their demos with amp sims, that it's not like the scariest thing in the world to be like, hey, we're not miking up a guitar amp. So I think it just kind of comes down to, again, that creativity and that workflow thing where it's like, I'm not fussing around with miking an amplifier or picking a distortion pedal or doing this or doing that. We're just plugging right in. We can track a lead right away. We can switch and track rhythms because we got a rhythm tone set. We can make a gross, grungy octave tone that just sits underneath everything. And we can do all that by literally clicking a couple buttons instead of like plugging in an amp and turning another one on and waiting for it to warm up and seeing if that sound actually works and tweaking a microphone, changing a cab. So to me, again, all this came out of just necessity of time. If you told me, if we could wake up tomorrow, like, you know what, you got 2 full months to do a record and you've got like 3 weeks of pre-pro you can do beforehand. It's like, cool, I'm going to mic up every single amp in this gigantic studio we're in, because that's obviously happening as well. And we'll set up the drum kit and we will like practice every single beat. So drums are done first. And so amps are done, whatever, but like without that happening, it's almost like the modern approach to doing something that was done in a very conventional way at one time. Like this is like the new conventional, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's great. And I think what's beautiful about it is there is no right or wrong answer, Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
When it comes to that, it's all about how you like to make records and how your mindset and your ideology jives with the band that wants to work with you. And then the results, thereafter speak for themselves in their own way, and I think that's what's great about it. And there's a million ways to make a record. So thank you for sharing this way and the way that this one was made with us specifically. We thoroughly enjoyed it. And we will, like I said, we will have to have you back to talk a bit more of that which will be seeing the light of day very soon in our mutual friends, our friends to the north, as I'll say. But for now, we will leave it there, and we really appreciate your time, man. I loved hearing about this, and it was long overdue. Yeah,
thank you. I really appreciate you having me on. Just like you said, we've chatted a whole bunch about little things. It's nice to finally sit down and dive in a bit, you know?
Absolutely. Well, you have yourself a nice time with that lovely bit of rock wool behind. Stay safe, stay vigilant up there, and enjoy springtime in Toronto. And hopefully our paths will cross very soon.
Oh, absolutely.
So if you're in the audio production world, you can definitely find Sam on a number of other shows online, speaking more specifically about the technical side of his productions and mixes. But we wanted to have him share the often overlooked side of making records, the journey that sets the stage for all the sexy gear and plug-in talk. It's the stuff life throws at you while you're in the trenches that can easily derail a song, a record, or even a career. And this story was a brilliant example of the belief everyone involved had in each other and the obstacles they had to overcome to make this record a reality. If you're a musician or in a band, I think it's worth noting the patience, the planning, and the trust it took for the guys in between you and me to get the product they wanted out of this release and their time with a producer like Sam. Nothing good comes easy. And maybe this was a lesson in the idea of triangulating quality, speed, and cost. Most of the time, you're lucky to get two of those three. And in this case, I think that what the band sacrificed in time more than paid for itself in the resulting outcome. And if you're on the most important end of the music business, that of a listener, I hope this brought you some interesting perspective on how much effort and planning goes into the making of this art form. So please remember that the next time a band you love comes through your town, drops a new record, or gives you any chance to support them and the creative journey they are on, because ultimately, they're doing it for you. Finally, we might be taking just a short break while we put together a brand new wave of interviews, but rest assured, we aren't going anywhere. So in the meantime, share your favorite episodes with the people that need them right now, subscribe to the show, and leave us a quick review or rating, and I promise we will catch you soon on